Good evening, everybody, to all of you watching on Zoom and the millions watching on YouTube. Welcome back to Mishnah Mastery. I know it's been a rough couple of weeks without our regular fix, but we are back, and we are going to be starting tonight a brand new Masechta, brand new topics. We are going to be delving into the world of Pesachim, all of the Mishnayot to do with Pesach. And as with all Mishnahs, sometimes you get a bit of Pesach, sometimes you get completely unrelated topics, but it's exciting all the same. So we're going to be looking at the halachas of the Yom Tov of Pesach. We're going to be starting off with a little bit, or theoretically it's before the Yom Tov of Pesach. We're going to be looking at Bedikat Chametz, the search for Chametz. As we know, we are not allowed to eat Chametz on Pesach. We are not allowed to benefit from Chametz on Pesach. And we are not allowed to have it in our houses. So that is what we kick off with. Is everybody ready? You bet your life we are. Let's crack on with Mishnah Pesachim, Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. Or la'aba asar. On the eve of the 14th of which month? Nisan. On the eve of the 14th of Nisan, Bodkin es hachametz le'or haner. We are supposed to search our houses by the light of a candle to be able to find chametz. Now, very interestingly, by the way, biblically, you're actually allowed to mavatel. You're actually allowed to disqualify, to nullify, to completely ignore chametz in your reshus, in your house. Theoretically, we can just say, I am removing all ownership and all connection to any chametz that is found in my house. And if you do that, so then you no longer own any chametz in your house. Theoretically, that is possible biblically. So we have the additional safeguard by the rabbis that because if a person finds it in their house, they might come to eat it. God forbid. And so therefore, that is why we have these extra protections in place, these extra safeguards of searching for chametz and getting rid of it, etc. So because of that risk that we might end up eating chametz on Pesach, therefore we have to search. We have to search for it. And even though really the prohibition for eating chametz gets activated the following day, nonetheless we are taught that we have to search at night with a candle. So that's how the Mishnah starts. On the eve, on the night of the 14th, that is when we search for Pesach by the light of the candle. But we're only supposed to go and search in places where chametz can actually reach. So the Mishnah continues, any place where chametz is not going to enter, you do not need to search there. Which is why, for those of you who tuned in before Pesach this year, and we were giving all of our online recommendations and tips and tricks and hacks to get ready for Pesach, and we said, if you don't take chametz up into the bedroom, then you don't theoretically need to clean up there, and you don't theoretically need to lift up and lift out the beds and detach all of the furniture from the walls and all the rest of it, because chametz isn't going to reach there. So a fascinating halacha. As we always point out, of course, dust is not the same as chametz, and sometimes people get a little bit confused between spring cleaning and Pesach cleaning, but we'll save that for another time. My wife's in the room, of course, so she's, making out like it's not an issue. Anyway, so continues the Mishnah. All right, so we don't need to be searching in places where you might, if you haven't taken chametz, but we're taught that you do have to check your wine cellar, right? So for all of us here in Bushi, we'll be extremely familiar with having to check our wine cellars before Pesach. And so for the next part of the Mishnah, we need to imagine that people will have had, rows and columns of barrels along their whole wine cellar, and that will help us understand diagrammatically what we're dealing with over here in this next part. The lama Amru shtei shuros b'martef makom shemachnisin bo chametz. So why is there a rule that we have to check 2 rows of barrels in the wine cellar, or 2 rows of jugs in the wine cellar? And it's because chametz could theoretically get there, especially if you're, they used to have waiters that would go down to the cellar to get things from the cellar in the middle of a meal. If he was taking some food down there with him, then he might have left some chametz down there. So what we're learning over here is that we do have to go down and we have to check 2 rows of the wine barrels or the jugs in the wine cellar. But there is a machlokes, a dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel as to which 2 rows you are supposed to check. So says the Mishnah, Beit Shammai omrim shtei shuros al panei kol hamartef. Beit Shammai say that you check the top surface, the top 2 rows. And Beit Hillel omrim shtei shuros hachitzonos shehein ha'elyonos. And let me rephrase that. Beit Shammai say that you are that you check the first 2 rows as they present themselves in front of you. So the first 2 columns, as it were, of barrels. According to Beit Hillel, you're checking the top 2 rows. So if I may show you this picture here in my notes, can everybody see that? So Beit Shammai say if we are walking into the alley, into the cellar this way, so you're presented with barrels in front of you. So they would say check these 2 columns, and Beit Hillel would say check the top 2 rows over there. So that's the machlokes in Mishnah. Moving on to Mishnah Base, it says as follows. Let's scroll down so we can see it on the page. It's been a while. Do we have to be worried about a weasel or some kind of rodent moving chametz around into different properties? Says the Mishnah, no. We do not need to worry that a weasel or a rodent is moving chametz from house to house or from place to place. Because if we were to be so worried about rodents and insects and things moving your chametz around, then there's not going to be any end to it. And you'll have to check the whole world, because theoretically your chametz could have gone anywhere. So that is Mishnah base. Moving on to Mishnah Gimel. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Boatkin or arba'asa uva arba'asa shacharis uvishas habir. We're trying to figure out over here how much time do we have to be able to check your chametz. So Rabbi Yehuda is telling us that we can check at any point right up until the shas habiur, the time for the destruction of chametz. So Rabbi Yehuda says you can search on the evening of the 14th, or you could search in the morning of the 14th, and right up until the time of destroying chametz. The Chachamim arim lo vadak or abasar. The Chachamim say if you didn't search on the night of the 14th, yivdok bar abasar, then you should search on the day of the 14th. Lo vadak bar abasar, if you did not check on the day of the 14th, yivdok v'tach hamoed. Then you've got to make, like, let's say you weren't at home and you're only getting home in the middle of Pesach. So according to the Chachamim, you would search in the middle of the festival. Lo vadak v'soch hamoed. If you did not search in the middle of the festival, yivdok la'achar hamoed, then you should search after the moed, after Pesach is finished. Why is this? The reason is because any chametz that was in your ownership throughout the festival of Pesach, once Pesach has passed, that chametz is still going to be forbidden to you, because we have a principle that if you have been in ownership of chametz throughout the festival of Pesach, then that chametz is still going to be forbidden to derive any benefit and to get any pleasure from. And so according to the Chachamim, if you didn't get an opportunity to search for your chametz before Pesach started, and you didn't get to do it during Pesach, then you'll have to just do it afterwards and make sure that you don't have any benefit, any pleasure whatsoever from the chametz that has been around for Pesach. So that is Mishnah Gimel. Moving on. No, it's not. We carry on. Sorry, my mistake. Umar Shemshaya, says the Mishnah. Umar Shemshaya, that which is left over, that which was not gotten rid of before Pesach, Yanechenu b'tzina, should be put away in a hidden place, kadei shlo yehei tzarech b'dika achor, so that you don't need to search again for it afterwards. So that is the end of Mishnah Gimel, I should say. Moving on now to Mishnah Daled. Rabbi Meir says, with regards to the process of getting rid of chametz on the 14th, how long do we have? How long do we have to be able to get rid of the chametz? So, biblically, we've got until midday, right? You can eat chametz until midday. However, as with a lot of things, we put safeguards in place to make sure that we don't end up eating at the wrong time and going beyond the time period, which is why we have this funny situation on Erev Pesach of a time to have finished checking your house and a time for destroying the chametz. Well, sorry, the time for destroying the chametz and the time for eating chametz. That's why we have the distinction over there. So Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir says, Ochlin kol chamesh v'sorfin b'tchilas sheish. So Rabbi Meir says that you could eat throughout the whole of the 5th hour and stop eating by the end of that. And at the beginning of the 6th hour, you should make sure that everything is being burnt. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ochlin kol arba, you can eat up until the end of the 4th hour. V'solin kol chamesh, and then the 5th is kind of in this kind of suspended animation. V'sofin b'tchilas sheish, and then you should burn it at the beginning of the 6th. So according to Rabbi Meir, we're talking about being done by about 11 o'clock. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're talking about being done by about 10 o'clock. So this period of suspended animation, you'd be allowed to benefit still, and you'd be allowed to sell it still, but you wouldn't be allowed to eat it. And it's anyway not yet forbidden biblically until the 12th hour. Continuing the Mishnah, in Mishnah, hey, V'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda also said, Shtei chalos shel toda pasulos, if you have 2 loaves of thanksgiving offering. No, let's try that one again. Come on, Rabbi Nick, focus. So this Mishnah is going to be dealing with the way in which they would alert everybody in Yerushalayim as to where they were up to in the process of getting rid of chametz. So they didn't really have clocks back then. So how would they indicate to everybody where they were up to in the process? So Rabbi Yehuda said, Shtei chalos shel toda pasulos menuchos al gag ha'etz daba. What they used to do was take, in the Beis HaMikdash, they would take 2 loaves of disqualified Thanksgiving breads, and they would put it on the roof of the porch in the temple. Translates it there as the portico. Okay, so if they were there at the beginning of the day, that's a good sign. If they're there, brilliant. Everybody knew that they could eat. Nitla achas, if they had seen that one had been taken away, then tolin. So then when they went into this period of limbo, into this period of suspended, whatever you call it, and the rule was lo ochlin v'lo sorfin, and they didn't eat and they didn't yet have to burn. Nitlu shteihen, but if they now both disappear, then hischilu kol ha'am sorfin. Then everybody knew that it was time to start burning. Rabban Gamliel omer chulin ne'echalin kol arba. Rabban Gamliel says, fundamentally he agrees with Rabbi Yehuda, but he has a slightly different take on the timings. So Rabban Gamliel says, chulin ne'echalin kol arba, that anything that was not set aside for the Beis HaMikdash could be eaten throughout the whole of the 4th hour, but truma kol chamesh. If it was truma, then you'd be allowed to eat that still in the 5th hour. But then, as he would agree with everybody else, the sofin b'tchilas sheish. But then in the 6th hour, that is when you really have to make sure that everything is destroyed. Moving on to Mishnah Vav. Scrolling down into our 6th Mishnah over here. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim Omer. Rabbi Chanina, the deputy for the Kohanim, the vice chief, as it translates there, of the priests, he would say, Mimehem shel Kohanim, in the days of the Kohanim, i.e. in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Lo nimneu melisrof es habasar shenitma bivlad hatuma im habasa shenitma ba'avatuma. Remember how we said sometimes we don't always discuss things to do with Pesach? I guess this would be a good example. So he said as follows: in all of the days of the Kohanim, they never refrained from burning meat that had become tamei bivlad hatuma, meaning meat that was contaminated by had become a sheni latuma. So it was a particular level of impurity. So if this meat reached this level of impurity, so they never refrained, let's try and get the wording right. They never refrained from burning the meat that had been contaminated to the level of a sheni latuma, im habasar shenitma ba'av hatuma. They didn't refrain from burning that with, i.e., I think that's saying that they would burn it with meat that had been defiled to a very, very high level of tumah, the av hatuma, which is an extremely high and potent level of impurity. So they would allow those things to come into contact, even though it would make it worse for this lower level meat, this lower level purity level. They would nonetheless burn those things together with things that had been contaminated to a higher level. As the Mishnah says, Afal Pisha Mosifin Tuma al Tumaso. Even though by bringing them into contact, you're making it worse for the Sheni Latuma, the lower level Tuma. So even though you're making it worse for that meat, nonetheless, they would still insist that those items be burnt together. Rabbi Akiva Ba'amar, Rabbi Akiva took this even one step further and said, Mimehem shel Kohanim, in the days of the Kohanim, at the time of the base of Mikdash, Lo nimnu milahadlik es hashemen shenifsal bitvu yom b'ner shenitma bitmeimes. So they would not prevent oil from being lit. And this oil may have only been touched by tavul yom, which again is a very, very low level. Somebody who has gone to a mikveh because he's impure, he has to wait till sunset before his status changes back to pure. So if they were to come into contact with oil in the Beis HaMikdash, and that oil is now no longer fit for use, so they would allow it to be burnt with ner shenitma b'tmeimes, with oil that had come into contact with a corpse, which is a very, very high level of tumah. So the gap between these two levels is greater, which is why it's considered to be an addition by Rabbi Akiva. But he would say that you can even bring things which are even further apart on the tumah scale. If it's these types of oils, they would even allow those things to be burnt up together. Afapisha mosifin tumah al tumah. So again, even though you're increasing the level of severity of the tumah, of the impurity, nonetheless, they would allow those things to be burnt together. I hope that made us some semblance of sense. Moving on to Mishnah Zion. Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, Midivreim lamanu. From their words, we learn the following thing: Shesorfin teruma tahora im hatmeya b'Pesach. Excuse me. If we think about it as a question, are we allowed to burn chametz, which is teruma, right? So we can't eat the chametz because it's Pesach, but it's a very high level of purity. It's teruma. It's been set aside for a holy purpose. Would you be allowed to burn that with something which is tamei, which is impure, and it has to be burnt anyway? So we can't have the benefit from the chametz on Pesach, but you're also not allowed to burn teruma. So the question that Rabbi Meir is dealing with here is, are you allowed to burn these things together? So Rabbi Meir is saying that I can learn from the previous Mishnah that actually you're allowed to burn teruma, which is pure. If it wasn't Pesach, you'd be allowed to eat it and you can't burn it. But because it's Pesach, you have to get rid of it. So he's saying you would be allowed to burn that im hatmeya b'Pesach. You'd be allowed to burn it with something which is impure on Pesach. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said to him, Eino hi amida. It's not actually the same reason. It's not a proper analogy, as it says on the screen over there. Modin Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua agree that you shouldn't bring them into contact with each other. And so they both require burning, but you shouldn't actually bring them together to be burnt up because of the contamination that arises from these items being mixed. What are they arguing about? They are arguing about teruma, which you're not sure if it is impure, and teruma, which is definitely impure. In which case, according to... One second. Oh no, I do have it. Sorry, for a second there, I didn't think I had the same text in my book, but I do. So what are they arguing about? They're arguing about teruma, which is doubtful. You're not sure if it's impure, and something which is impure. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, tisarif zula, they have to be burnt separately. So even if there's a doubt, it could very well be tameh. He's extremely strict and says they have to be burnt separately. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer shtein ka'achas, and Rabbi Yehoshua rules and paskins and says that they can be burnt together in one fell swoop. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing Perek Aleph, the first chapter of Maseches Pesachim. And guys, guess what? We're going to jump straight in to the second chapter. Special treat for you this evening. Here we go with chapter 2, Perek Beis, talking about again what we have to do with our chametz. So says the Mishnah in the first Mishnah of chapter 2. Kol sha'a shemut le'echol. Any time before Pesach where it is permitted to still eat your chametz. Oh, the best times are before then, yeah. So you are allowed to feed the chametz to your animals, to your cattle, to your chayas, to your beasts, and to your birds. And you're allowed to sell it to a non-Jew. And you're allowed to benefit from it's permitted to benefit from this chametz. Avar zmana, but once that time passes, aso b'hana aso, so now it becomes forbidden to have any benefit. V'lo yasik bo tanu v'chirayim, and you are not allowed to use it as fuel to fire up your ovens. So you're literally not allowed any benefit whatsoever once that crucial time has passed. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein bir chametz el asreifa. Rabbi Yehuda says, the only way that you can destroy your chametz is by burning it. But Chachamim say no, there are plenty of other ways that you could destroy your chametz. Af mefare v'zore la ruach or matil layam. The Chachamim say you could also crumble it, you could throw it to the wind, you could throw it in the sea. All of these would be effective methods of destroying your chametz, which is why we have this advice that if you do discover any chametz at the wrong time, then just pour bleach over it. Thank you very much, Shira. You just pour bleach over it, and that way you're completely destroying its use and its effectiveness, and you won't go near it with a barge pole. Don't know who's got a barge pole on them, but just in case you do, you wouldn't take it anywhere near your chametz. Moving on to Mishnah Beis. So biblically, again, we always have to appreciate that there's a distinction between what the Bible might say and what we add in as a safeguard. But biblically, any chametz that is owned by a Jew that went through Pesach is permitted to others after Pesach. They would be allowed to have benefit from that chametz after Pesach. However, we have a rabbinic addition, a rabbinic safeguard in place, so that people don't get any, ideas in their heads of staying in ownership of chametz throughout Pesach and then figuring out that they can just sell it on to a non-Jew afterwards. So rabbinically, we want to put a stop to all that. We don't want to risk at all Jews having any ownership of chametz throughout Pesach. And so rabbinically, it's going to be forbidden to Jews after Pesach, even though theoretically, biblically, it might be allowed. So we have a rabbinic safeguard in place. So the Mishnah says, chametz shel nachri she'avar alav Pesach, that if you have a non-Jewish person who owns chametz throughout Pesach and then is selling it on, mutar b'hana. So there you go. You're allowed to have benefit from it after Pesach. Well, that's relatively normal. We're all familiar with the mad rush to Tesco after Yom Tov to be able to get whatever bread you can straight after Yom Tov. And that's because if a non-Jew has owned bread over Pesach, you're allowed to benefit from it after Pesach. V'shel Yisrael, but if it's owned by a Jew, asur bahana. So then you're not allowed to have any benefit from it whatsoever. Shneimar lo yira'eh lecha sa'or. No leavened bread should be found in your possession. So you might say, well, hang on a minute, why is it allowed? Why, that seems to be a biblical proof that you're not allowed to have the benefit. And you said it was rabbinic. The truth is that the verse only applies to Pesach. That you're not allowed to have any chametz seen in your possession throughout Pesach. But then biblically, you'd be allowed to benefit from it afterwards. So that's why I say that it's a rabbinic safeguard put in place to make sure that we don't try and get into any funny business over Pesach with our chametz. Moving on to Mishnah Gimel, discussing chametz, which is used as collateral for a loan. They got up to all sorts back then. Nochri shehilva is Yisrael al chametza, a non-Jew who lent money to a Jewish person al chametza, with the chametz being used as collateral for the loan. So achar ha-Pesach mutar bahana. So after Pesach, that chametz is going to be permitted to him, because theoretically there was a, what would you call it, a lien on that chametz throughout Pesach, which was by the non-Jew, and so it wasn't really under the Jews' full ownership, and that's why it's going to be permitted. Continues the Mishnah, Yisrael shehilva es anachri al chametza. And if a Jew who has lent money to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew is having his chametz used as collateral, achar ha-Pesach asur bahana. So after Pesach, the Jew is not going to be allowed to benefit from that chametz, because theoretically that collateral has been under his auspices throughout Pesach. Continues the Mishnah, chametz shenafla alav mapoles. If you have chametz that has been buried by a what would you call it? Not an avalanche, but let's say that a building has collapsed, or something has collapsed on top of your chametz. So the Mishnah says, "Hare hu kamivor." So that, as if we need to be told, that chametz is considered to have been destroyed and out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. I ain't going to touch it. But there you go. You see it in the Mishnah as well. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, as long as the dog is not able to reach it and to search for it and to, claw away a little bit of the rubble and unearth this chametz, as long as he's not able to do that, then we consider it to have been buried, and we consider it to have been completely out of our minds and out of our ownership. Continuing with Mishnah Daled. What's interesting is that you can have the most expensive items of chametz, and yet over Pesach they are completely useless and they are completely valueless, and they don't mean anything to us. We don't want anything to do with them. So says the Mishnah, Ha'ochel trumas chametz for Pesach b'shogeg. A person who eats chametz on Pesach by accident, but the chametz that he eats was actually teruma. Now, normally, if a person who's not a Kohen eats teruma, then they have to pay back the value of the teruma plus a little bit extra. So says the Mishnah over here, that if a person, a non-Kohen, eats truma, which is chametz, on Pesach, and he eats it by accident, the din in the Mishnah, the ruling in the Mishnah is mishalim keren v'chomesh. Then he is supposed to repay the keren, which is the value of the truma that he ate, and he's supposed to add on as an additional fine a fifth, which is really a quarter. Whenever we say keren v'chomesh in the Mishnah, what we mean is as follows. we calculate a quarter of the principal, and you add that on, and now that becomes a fifth. So the total amount that you're paying represents, you're paying 1.25, as it were, of what was there originally. So you're adding on a quarter, but now it becomes a fifth. So that's what we mean. Does that make sense? I mean, you guys are all mathematically much cleverer than I am. This took me years to grasp. But yeah, you guys are just diving right in there. So, so he would have to pay the principal plus a fifth, which is actually a quarter, but it's a fifth in total. That's what we'd have to pay if he eats it by accident. But amazing, if he eats it on purpose, so we have an additional problem on our hands if he eats it on purpose, because he's actually going to be liable for kares. He's actually going to have a punishment of kares, of spiritual excision, resting on his head. So if he eats it on purpose, we actually say, patur mitashlumin umid me'etzim. Then he's actually going to be exempt from any payment and or any liability if he used it as fuel. And the reason for that is because we have a principle in Judaism that we don't punish twice. So we always give the stricter punishment, and then you end up having the lesser punishment removed or exempted from you. So that is why the result in the Mishnah is that if he was to eat it on purpose, he's not actually going to be obligated to pay anything, because he's going to have to just answer to the big boss instead with his punishment of kares, of being spiritually cut off from the Jewish people. So in either event, don't eat chametz on Pesach. That's how we could probably concisely sum up that Mishnah. Moving on to Mishnah Hey, the fifth Mishnah in our perek. So what can we use to make our matzahs and to fulfill our obligation of eating matzah on Pesach? So we can only use ingredients, we can only use grains that if we were to leave them, they would become chametz. So that is why we have the Mishnah as follows. These are the things that a person can fulfill his obligation with by eating them as matzah on Pesach. Bechitim, you can use wheat. Excuse me. Basa'orin, you can use barley. Bekusmin, you can use rye. Uvashifon, and you can use spelt. And shiboles shual, and you can use oats. So any of these 5 grains you can use for your mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. V'yotzein b'dmai uv'masa rishon shenitla trumaso. You can also use, excuse me, you can also use grain that came from damai. Damai we've encountered a couple of times. It's things that we're not sure if they were tithed properly, so they have a bit of a doubt about them. So we tithe them again, and then we can eat them. So the Mishnah is telling us that we can fulfill our mitzvah with those things. So, and you can use the 10% tithe as long as it has been corrected for teruma and part of it has been taken off to be given to a kohen. So as long as it's corrected, as long as it's theoretically fit for eating, you're allowed to use it for your mitzvah of eating matzah. Similarly, you can use the Ma'aser Sheni, which is the secondary tithe, and you can use consecrated things, hekdesh, which have been redeemed. So as long as there is no halachic issue with these foods, as we've seen in other Mishnayos, so you're allowed to use them for your mitzvah. And a Kohen is even allowed to, now don't get confused. This is not telling us that a Kohen is allowed to eat challah on Pesach. What this is telling us is that the challah tithe, the amount that got separated as the mitzvah of challah, which was then given to the Kohanim, it would most definitely be matzah. Make no mistake about it. We're not talking about a loaf of challah over here. We're talking about the mitzvah, the separation of challah. So Kohen is allowed to eat that, and he's allowed to eat teruma as well. He has the halachic right to eat those things. So as long as they're kosher Pesach, and as long as they're one of these 5 grains, you can use them for your mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. However, says the Mishnah, but not anything that has not been tithed correctly. You're not allowed to eat the Ma'aser Rishon, the first tithe, if it hasn't been corrected with the Teruma portion. And not with the second tithe, which has not been redeemed, and these sanctified items that have not been redeemed. If they haven't been redeemed, that means that they are still under forbidden status to be eaten. Chalos toda or kike nazir. What about loaves of Thanksgiving bread? Now, interesting to know that they would bring 40 loaves of whatever you want to call it, 40 loaves for every Thanksgiving offering. 30 of them would be chametz, it would be kosher Pesach. 10, let's try that one again. 30 of them would be matzah, and they would be kosher Pesach. 10 of them would be chametz. So the Mishnah says, chalos toda, if you have these Thanksgiving loaves, urakike nazir, or the wafers that were brought by a nazir, a nazirite. So of those, 20 of them would be matzot, 20 of them would be chametz. But says the Mishnah, asan la'atzmo ein yotzin bahem. If they have been brought as part of your own korban, then you're not allowed to use them. And that's because you're only allowed to use matzos that are made for profane purposes. But these have not been made for profane purposes. They have been made as part of your own korban. So you can't eat them. Asan lim korban shuk, but if they have been made to be then sold on in the market, because they're not all going to go for use as the korbanot, so if they've been made for resale, then yotzin bahen, you'd be allowed to fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah on Seder night with those matzahs. Now, as we all know, on Seder night, it's not only matzah that we have to eat, there's also the fun and games of eating maror as well. So, biblically, we know that we have to eat matzah and maror. So let's take a look at this next Mishnah. Ve'elu yirakos she'adam yotzei bahen yidei kavasa b'Pesach. These are the vegetables, the herbs, with which one may fulfill their obligation on Pesach of eating maror. Says the Mishnah. But chazeres, you can use chazeres, which we translate as lettuce. Uva ulshin, or you can use endives, endives, I don't know how you pronounce it. Endives, which translates it on the screen here as chicory. Anyone know what that is? Give us a thumbs up if you do. You do. Endives. Thank you. Uvatamcha, which I have translated as horseradish, but which the screen translates as wild chicory. Uvachavina, edible roots, which it translates there as picridium, as we all know what that is. Uvamara, which I translate here as bitter coriander, which it translates it there as sonchos. Okay. Yotzin bahen, bein lachin, bein yaveshin. You can use them, you can fulfill your mitzvah, whether they are moist or whether they are dry. Avalok vushin, but you can't use them, you can't fulfill your mitzvah with them if they have been pickled or preserved. Velo shlukin, or if they have been stewed up. Velo mevushalin, or if they have been cooked up and boiled. Umitzdarfin lechazayis, you can combine different types of maror into the required amount to fulfill the mitzvah of a kazayis, an olive bulk size, which is why I personally enjoy eating romaine lettuce with a little stalk of horseradish as well, just to really get that pain searing through my face. And you can also use the stalks of these herbs as part of the required amount. Uvadmai, and again, you can use these herbs if they are damai, if they have these questionable tithings. and you can use them if they are the first tithing that has been properly corrected, or a secondary tithing or consecrated item which has been redeemed properly and is fit for human consumption. Continues the Mishnah. Very interesting thing over here. We can't soak bran because it becomes chametz. But it would seem that you could put it in boiling water because this is going to slow the process of turning into chametz. However, I think I'm right in saying that because we don't really know the correct temperature to get this right, we don't really operate like this. But there we go. So the Mishnah says, "Ein shorin es hamursan l'tarnagol." We may not soak bran for chickens because it would become chametz, and even our animals cannot benefit from chametz on Pesach. However, says the Mishnah, aval choltin, you would be allowed to scald them. You'd be allowed to put them into boiling water. Says the Mishnah, ha'isha lo sishra es hamursan shetolech biyad ala merchat. A woman is not allowed to soak bran to be able to take with her to the bathhouse. Apparently, soaked bran was used as part of a person's cleaning regimen. Aval shafahi bibasara yavesh. But you would be allowed to rub dry bran onto your skin, and this would not pose a problem. Lo yelos adam chitin v'yaniach al makosa b'pesach. A person is not allowed to chew wheat and use that pulpy mixture to apply to a wound on Pesach. Mipnei shehein machmitzos. Very strict thing over here. That the moisture that you get from the saliva and things, that is going to turn it into chametz, and that is a problem on Pesach. Continues the last Mishnah in Perek Beis in the second chapter over here. Mishnah Ches. Ein nosnin esakemach letoch hacharoses. You're not allowed to put flour into your charoses mixture, or letoch hachardal, or into your mustard mixture. Ve'im nasan, if you did, yochal miyad. Then the first position in the Mishnah says you have to eat these immediately before they possibly turn into chametz. Rabbi Meir says absolutely not. Don't even touch the stuff. Says the Mishnah, you are not allowed to boil your korban Pesach. It has to be roasted. There can't be any water content whatsoever. So Pesach, you can't boil it up. Lo b'mashkin, not in water, not in liquids. V'lo b'meiperos, not in fruit juices. However, says the Mishnah, aval sachin umat bilin osabahen. But you are allowed to translated there is baste it and dip it into these liquids. What about water that has been used by a baker? So it would be water that a baker would kind of use to clean their hands from any dough that got stuck to their hands. So this water, what should you do with it? You shafchu, you pour it out, you get rid of it, because this water has the capacity to cause the dough inside to leaven. And so you must get rid of it on the festival of Pesach. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing the second chapter of Maseches Pesachim. And that's all for this week. Join us next time on Mishnah Mastery, where we will be delving into the exciting world of chapter 3 and hopefully chapter 4 as well. Keep well, everyone. Stay safe and have a wonderful